On February 24th, 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. Tanks began rolling across the border, bombs could be heard in the distance, and in the weeks since that event happened, we've all read in the news of the horrendous stories, the visceral images. We're all aware of what's happening in Ukraine. What some people are not quite as aware of, though, is what the cyberspace element of this conflict looks like. Cyberspace is a little bit more difficult to wrap your head around compared to physical space. And when you consider the myriad of different ways, different variety of cyber attacks that have been involved in this conflict, even if you are a little bit knowledgeable, it could be difficult to keep everything straight. And so the purpose of this briefing today is to give you an overview of what these cyber attacks by Russia and Ukraine have looked like, to categorize them, to talk about the responses to them, so that when you're reading this in the news, so that as a policymaker or a person interested in policy, you will be educated and have a framework for understanding what is going on in Russia. In particular, we're going to attempt to accomplish four things today. First, we're going to talk a little bit about some background information, understanding who are the key actors, both on the Russian side and on the Ukrainian side, so that when you see those names in the news, you'll know what they're talking about. We're also, by way of background, going to mention what the cyberspace looked like in the weeks leading up to the invasion, what kind of preparation was being done as far as we know. The second element of this presentation is going to be a deep dive into a bunch of different Russian cyber attacks that have been publicized. Various organizations like ESET and Microsoft have discovered vulnerabilities or discovered malware and made them public. I'm going to categorize these into 6 basic categories of cyber attack, depending on what the function and the capabilities of the malware are. So you're going to get a categorization of all of these different types. Once you understand that, once you understand the different categories and actions that have occurred in Ukraine, we can talk about the third element, which is what are tech platforms and others like volunteer hackers around the world doing about this? What kind of response have we seen that is novel to this conflict, and what can we learn from it for the future? The final thing we'll discuss is this surprising lack of cyber attacks, lack of massive cyber attacks compared to what many experts predicted. Lots of articles talked about how they're going to be, if Russia does invade, there's going to be potentially massive cyber attacks that knock out the Ukrainian power grid for long periods of time. Basically, what's puzzled researchers and what's puzzled experts is that we've not seen that happen. There have been some cyber attacks. It's not that many more than there were before the invasion. And the sort of massive crippling attack that was predicted might be a possibility has not happened. So we will talk a little bit about why that's the case. And in particular, what I will present to you is that cyber offense in this particular context is maybe not as useful as you might think intuitively. But before we get into background, there's one last thing that I ought to mention, a disclaimer. Been working on this project over the last several weeks, and just right at the end, right about to finish it, Microsoft drops this big report just this week, April 27th, you can see the date there, that challenges some of these notions. It says, look, there's actually a little bit more going on in cyberspace than previously was understood. Maybe not as much as people were alarmed about going into the conflict, but more than was previously understood. So obviously this report hasn't been integral to my research process throughout, but it is a very important document, and even though it kind of came at the last second, I think it's important for me to talk about it. So I will have a couple of slides related to this. I will be engaging with it, but it isn't as integrated to the overall presentation as I would have preferred if the report had come out maybe a month earlier. First, we're going to talk a little bit of background. Who are some of the key actors on both the Russian side and the Ukrainian side that you should be aware of in terms of vocabulary? And also, what did the pre-invasion cyberspace look like in the weeks, months, and years leading up to the Russian invasion? We'll begin with the attacker side, key actors. The biggest actor in general here is, of course, the Russian government. Most of the cyber attacks that have been perpetrated against Ukrainian companies, against the Ukrainian government, have been in some way affiliated with the Russian government. The primary entity responsible for this is something called the GRU. It does not stand for something that is GRU in English. It's a cross language acronym. It stands for the Main Directorate of the General Staff of the Armed Forces. So this is something that's housed in the Russian military, but is a cyber arm of that military. Within the GRU, there are different teams. So there's the Sandworm team, there's the APT-29 team. These are teams that work on developing malware, work on developing all sorts of different attacks. And as you can see right there, that's one group. I believe that's the Sandworm group from the GRU on a wanted list by the FBI. We also have the crest of the GRU at the top right. Now, if you're somewhat well versed in Russian activity online, something that you might be aware of is the FSB, the Federal Security Service. Again, the acronym doesn't quite line up because of the language. The FSB is pretty active when it comes to misinformation in general around the world, including with regard to the United States. But with regard to what's going on in Ukraine, specifically in cyber attacks, malware, that side of things, the FSB does not have that big of a role. So if you've heard of them before, or you're familiar with them, for what we're talking about today, the GRU is more the operative entity, not the FSB. There are also some other groups whose relationship to the government is suspected to exist, but is not entirely known. So some of the things that we'll talk about today, they've been attributed to someone with some sort of name that is in the code, or we don't know a lot about them. We have this name for them. Maybe they're affiliated with the Russian government. Maybe they are Russian supporting the war effort, but are not affiliated with the government. I think what you find is that in most cases, eventually, with enough digging, we find out that they are related to the Russian government, but there will be some actors that we'll talk about where we don't know off the top, on the front end at least, whether they are affiliated. The other super interesting actor here is that it's not just Russia that's gotten in on this. There is a Belarusian organization called UNC 1511, who's not named that because they're very bad at basketball, like UNC Chapel Hill is. As a Duke student, I have to throw that in there. I don't actually know why they're named that, but the important thing is that they are affiliated with the Belarusian government. So they are a state-affiliated entity in Belarus that has been engaging in cyber attacks against Ukraine. That's a pretty big deal because it means, Belarus is not engaged in the war. They've been helping Russia somewhat, but they're not at war with Ukraine. And so when you think about questions of kinetic war versus cyber war and what's considered war and other uses of force, it's a really interesting issue that we'll talk about a little more in depth when we talk about UNC 1511's cyber attacks. There's also a set of key actors on the response side that it's good for you to be aware of. The first of which is the Ukrainian government. So if you read a lot of these articles and press releases, there's two main sort of entities that come up. One is the Computer Emergency Response Team, or CERT. So this is the team that is responsible for kind of patching things, basically the technical side of things. They're quoted in a lot of these articles. The other entity you should be aware of is the State Service of Special Communication and Information Protection. This individual, Victor Zora, that's listed there, is quoted in many, many different articles about this, sort of the point person or the face of the Ukrainian response in terms of answering questions from the media. So these are two terms that I might be throwing around that you should be aware of. There's also the United States government. CISA has been releasing notices or warnings on its websites about particular cyber attacks and how companies in the United States and abroad can better protect themselves, because a lot of these worms and malware, they're targeted at Ukraine, but they could go anywhere in the world, including the US. So that's why the US is involved in that in terms of CISA. Big tech companies are also involved. We're going to talk a lot about Microsoft and some of the very novel things that they're doing. But also Google. Google has an anti-DDoS software that they are now offering to websites in Ukraine. And ESET. ESET has been responsible for finding or figuring out a lot of these malware attacks and then publicizing them and working towards a patch. Finally, some of the Ukrainian companies that have been targeted themselves, we'll talk about Viasat and UKR Telecom. These companies, when they're attacked, they're relevant actors in that they have to figure out what to do. They have to figure out who they're going to call from the government, what sort of private organizations they're going to get in, how internally they can get the system that's offline back on track, get their website, get defamatory content off their website if their website was hijacked. Whatever it is, these companies are important actors because they're the ones affected and they're the ones who have to decide what they're going to do about it. The other piece of background that it's good for you to know is what was happening in the cyberspace in Ukraine in the weeks, months, and years leading up to the invasion. So I have a playground here on the slide because one of the sources that I read described the situation in Ukraine from the Crimean invasion in 2014 to the most recent Russian invasion in 2022 as a playground. In other words, there were all sorts of Russian government, Russian non-government, but affiliated organizations experimenting, practicing, attacking cyber targets in Ukraine pretty consistently all the time. Ukraine was subjected to targets a lot. One of these attacks was called the NotPetya ransomware program. So this would reach data, encrypt it, and then lock them out of their own files. And this is the classic ransomware. That's how ransomware works, right? The problem with it, well, not a problem, I mean, one of many problems with it was that it spread beyond Ukraine's border. So it went all the way around the world, and the end result was $10 billion worth in damages. It's considered one of the worst cyber attacks, one of the most destructive in monetary terms cyber attacks that was directed at Ukraine and spread around the world. And I mention that one in particular because some of the ones that were used during the invasion are similar versions to that, somewhat more advanced actually, although they won't have been as effective because of how similar they are. We'll get into that. What's important to understand about this though, or think about is, okay, Ukraine has been subject to these attacks since 2014. What that means is that they've been forced to develop a good response, good mechanisms for responding to these sorts of attacks. They've been forced to think about how centralized they want their internet to be. Russia's internet, for example, is a lot more centralized, the way that Ukraine's internet, literally in terms of like the routers and the wires and everything, the way it's set up is more decentralized. So that is important to understand that on the Ukrainian side, they have gained experience. On the Russian side, they've also been gearing up for this invasion, right? Practice, like I said, but also the Microsoft report that just came out the other day says that according to Microsoft, what they've observed is that pre-positioning for this particular conflict, for some of the attacks that happened in and around the invasion, happened as early as March of 2021. So the news articles, I think, in advance of the conflict were very much along the lines of Russia might invade, they might not, probably not. Not many people thought it was going to happen. But what's interesting about this is that it suggests that Russia at least had some inkling that they might do something like this over a year ago in March of 2021. So that has implications beyond just cyber policy, that has implications for our understanding of the conflict in general. But those are the important things for you to understand about what was going on in the time leading up to the invasion. And we're going to get into a lot more specifics about the Russian cyber attacks during the invasion and how those relate back to NotPetya and some of the other things that were happening. Let's jump right in and talk about these cyber attacks. Most of them happened on the day of the invasion or in the weeks following, but there will be a couple that we'll talk about that happened in like January of 2022 in preparation for the invasion. And so I'll show you the date for each of them, but that's something I want to make clear from the outset. Now, when you're thinking about the various cyber attacks that have happened, there are tens of them. I'm going to cite a few key examples of some of the prominent ones here. In order to understand what is going on and wrap your mind around it, it's useful to categorize them based on what their function is and what the capability is of the malware that's employed. And so the categories I have before you are not entirely mutually exclusive. For instance, attacks to gain sensitive information. Some like website attacks could fall under that as well. But this typology, as you'll see, is a good general way to group things. And to the extent that there are ambiguities between things, we'll tease that out a little bit as we go through it. So the 6 categories are wipers, basically those things that are devoted to deleting a bunch of data for destructive reasons. Ransomware is also kind of a subcategory of that. Website attacks, so this includes things like distributed denial of service attacks, as well as attacks which go in and actually change the content of the website. The previous slide that I showed you, and we'll, I think, come back to that image in a moment, is an example of that sort of attack. Phishing, of course, is when trying to get login information by sending people to a fake web page. Multiple different entities in Ukraine have suffered from phishing attacks, as we'll talk about. Infrastructure attacks, this is a really big category that people are very worried about, not just in Ukraine in this conflict, but in general in the United States, in the world. And so we'll talk about, in particular, internet service providers and telecom providers and what relatively success, but limited success, Russia has had in targeting these things. Attacks to gain sensitive information. This is exactly what it sounds like. This has more to do with the function than the capability in terms of this category. But when you think about Russia going in and occupying towns and trying to round up leaders or people that they might think are a problem, if they have a bunch of data on Ukrainian citizens, where they live, who they're associated with, that's very powerful in their eyes. Finally, this is something that was not on this slide several days ago. Now it is, because it came out in the Microsoft report. The idea of an attack, of a cyber attack paired with a kinetic attack. So for instance, you call in an airstrike on a building that houses some sort of organization, and about the same time, you cyber attack that organization. So these are the 6 categories we're going to go through. As you can see, the first 4 are mostly based on what is actually happening, and then the last 2 categories overlap a little bit, and they're more about, in the case of sensitive information, what is the purpose of it? In the case of kinetic attack, what is happening at the same time that that's happening? So the first category that we'll talk about is wipers. Again, these are things that are designed, malware that's designed to go in and delete data for destructive purposes. The first one of these was called Whispergate, and it happened about a month before the invasion on January 13th. Our best estimate, it's not 100% confirmed, but it's believed that Sandworm, one of those sub-teams of the GRU, was responsible for this attack, which basically targeted the government, some nonprofits, some information tech companies. Pretty wide-ranging attack. Over 70 government agencies were effective. You can see I've listed a couple of them up there. And there were a couple interesting things about the way that the virus actually worked. The first is that it was designed to look like ransomware. It would come up with a ransom message and everything, but there wasn't actually a way to decrypt your data. It just completely destroyed the data rather than decrypting it. So we don't know why they made that choice. It's a departure from what's happened in the past, but that's an area for future research or thought is, why would they make a ransomware prompt when it's actually not ransomware? Additionally, it's good to understand kind of at the base level how this works. And I'm spending a little more time on this first one because the other ones will be pretty similar. So in the case of Whispergate, there were actually 2 wipers involved in this program. First, it would try to destroy your master boot log. Now, we're not going to get too in the weeds in terms of the details here, but basically that's pretty catastrophic and bad. You don't want that to happen to your computer. Sometimes, though, that would fail because of a defense mechanism called partitioning that, again, we don't need to talk about. In that case, instead it would go to all of your files that had a bunch of different extensions like .doc, .xls, all of these common file extensions, and just overwrite each file with a blank file, destroying all of your data, essentially. That's the way it works. As you can imagine, this would be pretty destructive if it happens to your computer. It's not the case that any of these government agencies were completely crippled or anything, but it was certainly an inconvenience for them and for particular individuals within them who had their data destroyed. The final thing I'll mention is just that the code isn't the same, but some of the effects are actually considered an improvement on NotPetya, according to what I've read. So the fact that we went from something that caused an immense amount of damage worldwide to something that's even an improvement about it over that, but was handled better, kind of shows you the power of cyber defense in the Ukraine and what having 8 years of these cyber attacks has built up in terms of capability of responding to these things. Another of these wiper attacks was called Hermetic Wiper. It's named after Hermetica Digital Ltd, which is the kind of That's the legitimate company that the security certificate, the digital certificate, was issued under for this attack. That company wasn't actually involved. They spoofed it essentially. But that's what it's named after. And note the timing of this one, February 23rd. So this is the evening before the invasion. This one is associated with a different part of the GRU called Iridium, again, a kind of sub-team involved in the GRU. And just like the last one, it targeted government, nonprofit, infotech. Really, this one is very similar to Whispergate, the one we just talked about. The difference is the timing. Like it's not coded exactly the same. It targets your master boot log still. It's also a ransomware decoy. You can see on the right there specifically what the ransomware prompt was for this one. Two differences, though, I guess really one difference in two forums between this and the last one is that there were three different components to this. There was the wiper itself, there was the ransomware thing that kind of operated alongside that, not in all cases, but in some of the cases. And then there was Hermetic Wizard, which was a worm that actually worked to spread this around. And part of the reason that there was a worm this time rather than not having this kind of partition like the previous one did is that what this malware actually did was it would wipe itself after it had deleted all the files. It would then wipe itself from the disk. So the previous one didn't do that, was easier to discover, but this one, it would get in, do its business, and then overwrite itself so that it would be harder to track. You couldn't pick up the computer of someone who had been compromised by this and figure out what had happened because the program itself was no longer on the computer. So that was kind of the additional contribution of Hermetic Wiper, but other than that and the timing, pretty similar to the first wiper that we talked about. The third wiper happened on February 24th, so the day of the invasion, called Isaac Wiper. It didn't work very well. On February 25th, the attackers basically released a new version of it with debug logs because it wasn't working super properly. So this one didn't have that big of an effect, and it was pretty similar to Hermetic Wiper in terms of how it actually worked. It just the code, the actual execution of the code was different, but the functionality was the same. But similar to Hermetic Wiper, the systems in place that this affected, like there was some sort of malware underlying waiting for this to happen prior to February 24th. So this one did not work as well. There's not as much on the internet about it because it didn't cause that much of a stir. But just like the others, it's presumed that this is GRU. Really, even though it's not confirmed, I could say with a very high degree of confidence that it is affiliated with the Russian government directly, because the timing is too much to be coincidental, right? The idea that you would have these two different wiper attacks, one the day before the invasion, one the day of the invasion, the idea that that wasn't coordinated with the people who were planning the invasion itself strains credulity. And then the last thing to mention on this is just that this one didn't target nonprofit and information technology companies so much. It was mostly just targeted at government networks. The final wiper that I'll tell you about is called Caddy Wiper. Note that there's a jump in time here. When we were talking about February 24th, now we're talking about March 14th in terms of when it was documented, and it had been operating a few days before that. We don't know who carried this one out, probably a Russian affiliated group. It is different from the other wipers we talked about in that it doesn't do this ransom masquerade. And ESET, the company that found it, says that it doesn't have many code similarities with Hermetic Wiper and Isaac Wiper, but in terms of the functionality and in terms of what it's trying to do, it's very much in line with the others. And so my take on it is that it's likely that it is a Russian, directly state-affiliated Russian group, even if it hasn't been confirmed. Now, the other interesting thing to note about this one is that with Hermetic Wiper, we talked about how it overwrites itself. So if you pick up the computer of an affected person, you can't figure it out. This one doesn't do that. The technical name for this is that it doesn't erase information on domain controllers. Without getting into the technical details of what that means, one of the articles I read said that this is probably a way for the attackers to maintain some level of access inside the organization while they're doing this. So Hermetic Wiper, the worm gets it in there, kind of scorched earth, everything's gone, whereas this has an effect, and there's still a kernel in there for future attacks. So when you think about the progression of these things over time, it might make sense why early in the conflict, Russia may be thinking it won't last long, didn't feel like something like that was necessary, and then took the time to develop something a little more advanced, something that can stay in there a little more and potentially help in the future. So when you think about these wipers, in conclusion, there's been a few of them across really since January, and they have affected companies, they have affected governmental organizations, they've inconvenienced them, but we haven't seen something catastrophic at this point. We haven't seen something on the scale of what some people were worried about might happen. The second category of attack that we will talk about is website attacks, both website defacement and distributed denial of service attacks. So looking first at website defacement, this was something that happened just like the first wiper we talked about before the invasion in the weeks leading up during that tense time period on January 15th. In particular, what happened was a host of governmental agency websites were hijacked such that instead of showing their normal content, they showed this message here at the bottom. The message is in Ukrainian and Russian and Polish, and the rough translation is you should be very scared, bad things are going to happen. So there's some speculation that this was meant mostly as a diversion from other cyber attacks that were happening. Maybe it was meant to spread fear, maybe it was just meant to muddy the information environment. We're not exactly sure why this happened, but that is the nature of the message that was communicated by this. Now, originally, when this first came out, it was thought that Russia was behind it, understandably so. Some of the methods were similar to what the SolarWinds 2020 campaign used. However, upon further research, what was discovered is that this Belarusian group, UNC 1151, was in fact responsible for this. So like we talked about at the beginning, very interesting that an organization from Belarus is choosing to get involved in this. The other subcategory of website attacks is distributed denial of service, when you overwhelm a website's traffic to take it down. These have been happening throughout the conflict. One of them is confirmed to have been by the GRU. One of them was confirmed to be using a sort of malware for hire site called DanaBot. So we sort of know who was hired to do it. We don't know who hired them to do it. Probably the Russian government. But regardless, this has attacked things like the Defense Ministry website and also the banking sector of Ukraine. Banking sector was attacked February 15th to 16th. Again, similar to the wiper, not a catastrophic attack, some impacts. And then in March, the Ministry of Defense was taken down, and the Russian POW database. This one is really interesting because, so what this website is the Ukrainians set up this website so that if you're in Russia and you want to know if your family member or someone, your friend, is a prisoner of war held by Ukraine, you can go on this website, search for them, and it'll show you a photo and everything. Probably an effort by the Ukrainians to get Russians to be against the war, to not be happy with their regime. And so it makes sense why Russia would want to target that database and make it inaccessible through a DDoS attack. We've also attacked mapping services. Mapping services are important in terms of, not just civilians, but soldiers as well, and getting around. It's just a form of infrastructure that you can attack, and if you can take that down, then you can inconvenience people and potentially make your invasion easier. The third category is phishing, and there's a couple instances of this that we're going to talk about. The first one was February 25th, so right around the time of the invasion, the second day of the invasion. This one, our old friend, not really, our old foe, UNC 1151 was responsible for this. That's the Belarusian state-sponsored organization. And so what the previous one was a little surprising to see them doing this web defacement. This sort of phishing campaign, they have a history of doing in Lithuania, Poland, earlier in the Ukraine, in Latvia. They've also tried to plant fake news, anti-NATO stories. So they have a little more history with this sort of activity. And what they did was they sent phishing emails to a bunch of Ukrainian military email accounts in an effort to get someone to log in, give up their credentials. was not successful. It was discovered, so they didn't actually get any military credentials, and partially because of that, we don't actually know what their motive was. It could be that they were looking for espionage, right? They wanted to see what was going on the Ukrainian side of things, have someone on the inside in terms of email. Um, but it could be that they were planning to do something disruptive with it as well, in terms of either the address books or sending emails from that person that aren't actually from that person. We don't know what the motive was exactly, but we do know that they were pretty unsuccessful when it came to phishing these military emails. Now, there was also an effort sometime in February to phish Ukrainian media companies, and you can see on your screen there what this is an actual screenshot of what that phishing email looked like. I was not able to find good data or good information on whether this was successful or not. It's hard to know if the affected news organizations aren't going to actually release their own data about that. So we don't know how successful it was, nor do we, again, know what the motive was. Could be that they were trying to get information about journalists so that once they'd invaded, they had kind of a target list. It could be that they were hoping to somehow relate this to spreading fake news. Not sure what the motive of either of these phishing attacks were, but as far as we can tell, these two particular ones, the first one didn't seem to have much impact at all in terms of the military. This one, it's unclear. Certainly the impact hasn't been catastrophic, and it's somewhat run-of-the-mill for phishing attacks to be going on, but nonetheless, it is an important element of the Russian cyber attack space that you should be aware of. This next category of threats to infrastructure is probably the one that people are most concerned about. And indeed, of the attacks we've talked about so far, this is probably the most destructive. So right around the time of the invasion, on February 24th, you had this outage by Viasat, which is a satellite internet company in Ukraine. Basically, the GRU, presumably, was able to get into a misconfigured VPN, install malware on a bunch of modems, such that 30,000 of them basically became bricks. So it took a few days to resolve this and to get network operability back online because they had to ship out 30,000 brand new modems to all of these people. So that is costly. But at the same time, I don't want you to walk away with the impression that internet was just down in Ukraine at this time. Most of Ukraine's internet worked, most of Ukraine's satellite internet worked even, but some customers from this particular organization, this particular company, did have their internet cut. There were also spillover effects from this. A lot of the things we've talked about haven't had this so much, but there's a German wind turbine company that reported that they had to shut down their wind turbines for multiple weeks because of problems related to this. So when we talk about spillover effects, and we'll get a little bit later into is Russia not attacking as much because they're worried about too many spillover effects, there are some that have happened so far, as that German company can certainly attest to. The final thing I'll say on this is that it's important to note this wasn't just February 24th, attack happens, and then it's done. According to this company, the attackers have actually been, while they're trying to do mitigation work, the attackers have been continuing to attack them and try to counter that mitigation work and prevent them from fixing it. So this is probably one of the more active, one of the more destructive, attacks that we've talked about so far. It wasn't just satellite internet that the Russians attacked, though. They also attacked more traditional internet. So on February 24th, a company called Triolan was attacked, and then later in March, so that was right the day of the invasion again, and then later in March, UKR Telecom, another general telecom and internet company, was attacked. And so without getting into the technical details of what happened in these particular cases, kind of went a little more into that on the previous one, each of these were outages of services, but each of them lasted less than 24 hours. The first one, the Triolan one, was definitely, it says perpetrator unknown. I believe it was definitely the Russian government, because where it was the effects were greatest was in the Kharkiv region, which is the area that was most subject to the Russian invasion at that point. So it was very clearly an attempt to disrupt communication within the region that Russia was invading at that point. Later, UKR Telecom, The way that worked was Russia had invaded, right? They were occupying certain territory, and they were able to get login credentials off of an employee who was in that area. I don't know the details of what that looked like. They said that that employee is now safe. I can't imagine that it was particularly savory, but they were able to get that employee's credentials, and that just goes to show how the real world and the cyber world, the human element is important, right? You can do all of these things to try to steal someone's password, but if you have them physically in your grasp, under your power, you can also, in some cases, force them to give you the information that you need to log into something. Also on this slide, you just have that graph there. If you can kind of see at the right, it shows this big drop-off in connectivity that represents this breach. This is from the Triolan company. So the final exemplar of an infrastructure attack that we'll talk about here is a power grid attack. This is not something that actually happened. This is something that was planned to happen on April 15th. And then earlier that week, on I believe it was April 12th, the Ukrainian government announced that they had discovered this, that it was not going to happen. But hackers were targeting an energy company, trying to set down a bunch of substations. And what Ukraine estimates is that if they'd been successful, it would have caused blackouts for about 2 million people. Now, fortunately, this was caught. And on the one hand, that sounds like kind of a whole new level of something bad, frankly, right? Power going out in the country is a lot worse than some of the other things we've talked about in terms of threatening messages being placed on websites. However, it's also important to note this is a variant of a 2016 attack that was successful, but the power grid was only offline for an hour. Now, people can die because a power system is offline for an hour. I don't want to minimize that. But at the same time, when you think about these infrastructure things, the internet companies were down for fewer than 24 hours. The satellite internet was down for a few days. And it wasn't any of those companies, it wasn't all of their network. The power grid attack offline for an hour when that happened. When you compare that with some of the more cyber 9/11-y type of rhetoric or expectations that some people had, there's a pretty stark difference. What we've seen is that companies are pretty good at bringing things back online. It's very hard to attack one of these key infrastructure systems in a way that is truly going to be irrevocable for quite a long period of time. So that's my kind of takeaway from these things, is that they have been destructive, they have had an impact, but it's not as alarmist as some people would lead you to believe. So as we shift to the fifth of the 6 categories, we're now less talking about functionality and talking a little more about what the purpose of the breach is. There might be a little bit of overlap. Particularly, we're talking about breaches or malware, all these sorts of things that are intended to gain sensitive information. So one of them, for example, is efforts made by an organization called Strontium. Don't have a green box or gray box on here because there's not a lot of information about this. This just came out in the Microsoft report. But basically, this is one of the GRU affiliated groups that it's believed is targeting data. Sandworm, a lot of the other organizations are explicitly seem to be more about destruction, about infrastructure. This one is targeting data. And the really scary thing about this is that just think about what that sort of data could be used for. I alluded to this earlier in the presentation, but here's a quote that basically says that if Russia has invaded a country and is occupying the territory, we already know that they want political information. They want to know who community leaders are. They want to know who is likely to be a problem for them so they can imprison them or separate them. And so if Strontium is able to, there's been some suggestion, we're not really sure, again, a lot of uncertainty around this one. There's some suggestion that they may have been able to hack into automobile records, for example, which includes the names and addresses of people. If you have a database of where people live, what their name is, how old they are, all of this information, potentially very problematic. So we don't know a lot about this because some of the other things that we've talked about could have been about information gathering as well, right? You think about phishing, possibly the end goal of that was to gather information, possibly not. Regardless, we don't know a lot about this, but it has potentially very scary applications, and this is something that we should definitely devote a lot more of our time and energy to trying to figure out what Russia is doing in this area. So the final category that I'll talk about here is attacks that are paired with kinetic attacks. This comes from the Microsoft report that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. Is hot off the press. Had not really been reported on much before Microsoft came out with that. And what this Microsoft report says is that actually there have been hundreds of subtle attacks, many of which have been timed to coincide with kinetic attacks. So for instance, they say on March 1st, there was, missiles were fired an airstrike at a TV tower in Kiev. Same day, hackers hacked media companies in Kiev, and the result of this whole process was, we don't know what was due to the TV tower going down and what was due to the hack really, but the overall result of this was disruptions in service by that TV station. On March 11th, this Ukrainian city that I'm not going to try to pronounce suffered a malware attack, and they also suffered airstrikes the same day. So what Microsoft is basically saying is that a new category, and it cuts across some of the others, right? But a new category that you have to think about is this hybrid where you have a kinetic attack combined with a cyber attack. There's a lot more discourse to be had about this. I personally, as we might get into a little bit later, am not convinced that this is that revolutionary, in the sense that it's not obvious that just because this is being done, that the cyber component is adding much to the success of the kinetic attack. But again, this is hot off the press that this has been going on throughout the conflict, so more research and more thought needs to be given, and it will be interesting to see in the coming days and the coming weeks what various newspapers and experts have to say in response to this Microsoft report that has come out. So what have we learned about Russian cyber attacks? Well, we've learned a typology for thinking about them: wipers, website attacks, phishing, infrastructure attacks, attacks to gain sensitive information, and attacks that are paired with kinetic. And we've learned about a lot of very specific examples of what Russia has been up to. The next question then becomes, what has the response to this look like? We're going to talk mostly about tech companies, but also a little bit about the Ukrainian government and volunteer hackers from around the world. The first company I'll talk about is ESET. So ESET is a global digital security company that's actually based in Slovakia, which is in the Eastern Europe vicinity, and they have been very important through this process. 3 of those 4 wipers that we talked about were discovered by ESET. So they detect it, they investigate it to try to attribute who was responsible for it, and they also, not always them directly, but they bring people together to work on patches and publicize those patches once they're ready. Have the 3 examples there listed on the slide of what they've worked on. And the other aspect of this that they've been involved with is education. So you can see the flyer on the slide there for a session that they had, just advertised on Twitter that people could come to if they were curious. And ESET is also, like the antivirus on my own computer is from ESET. So it's a company that many consumers are familiar with. So that's been part of their role in the education space. So ESET has been kind of a traditional cybersecurity. All right, we find out about a vulnerability, we're going to publicize it, we're going to help people with it, we're going to post that publicly. That is not super unprecedented, but has been very important during this conflict. Another company that you may have heard of, maybe not, is Google. Google has something called the Threat Analysis Group, which has been working, their goal essentially is to counter government-backed attacks. So you're not looking at all forms of malware, all forms of cyber attacks, specifically state-run attacks. They were involved in the phishing side of things in terms of detection. If you think about Gmail and the spam filter and everything, that kind of makes sense. And they've also been involved on the mitigation side, specifically with regard to DDoS attacks involving Project Shield. So Project Shield is the name of this free DDoS counter protection plan that, in the wake of the events that are happening in Ukraine, Google has expanded eligibility to a bunch of Ukrainian government, banking sector, etc. websites that previously were not eligible for this. So just like ESET, what Google is doing is somewhat conventional, but again, is also important towards countering these cyber attacks. The one company that I would say is not just doing conventional important things that have been done in the past is Microsoft. Microsoft is a US-based global tech company, and what they have been doing is pretty innovative and pretty interesting. So one aspect of this is a pretty unprecedented public-private partnership. Public-private partnerships are talked about a lot in public policy related to a whole bunch of different things. But what's happening right now in terms of crisis management, in terms of security clearances being given to Microsoft officials who are working on this, in terms of briefings being given, classified briefings, giving them the information that they need to know, in terms of legal processes that let Microsoft go after websites faster than they would otherwise be able to, go after websites that are propagating some of this malware and some of these attacks. This is an infrastructure that Microsoft, at least in terms of the legal decisions, has been building up in anticipation of something like this. And it's really innovative, the extent to which they're doing this. And because of the fact that they're getting these briefings and getting these security clearances, they've been able to do two things. One is fulfill a similar role to ESET and have even more resources, right? Detecting, attributing, patching malware. But the other is that big report that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, right? This report is fundamentally shifting, has the potential at least to shift the conversation around the prevalence of Russian cyber attacks, the landscape of Russian cyber attacks. And the reason that that was possible was because of how closely they've been working with the government, how closely they've been briefed on everything in exchange for this really good work that they're doing to help protect the people of Ukraine. The final tech company I'll talk about here is SpaceX. Kind of threw this in here as a little bit of an oddball one, but it is pretty interesting. So remember how we talked about the satellite internet company that was not functioning, that had some outages with the 30,000 modems and everything? Well, someone tweeted at Elon Musk and said, hey, our satellite internet's not working. Can you do something about this? And so Elon Musk responded, yep, Starlink service, which is a satellite internet sort of thing from SpaceX, is now active in Ukraine, more terminals en route. Whatever you think about Elon Musk as a person, not really super relevant here. I think this is a really cool example of a company going in, seeing a need, and providing technology. And in the responses on this Twitter thread, one thing Elon Musk says is that, look, there was a cyber attack against this other satellite org. So you bring in SpaceX trying to make up for it. They were also subject to attacks while they were doing this, but they had the cybersecurity mechanisms in place that their network was able to not go down. So it wasn't the case that this was, it wasn't like February 24th, the attack happens, immediately Starlink is in there operating. So there was still a time period when these things weren't possible, when connectivity wasn't possible in terms of satellites, but it was something that is kind of a novel approach or something you haven't seen as much in the past to helping with something like this. The final thing I'll say about response is cyber offense. It's an interesting concept, right? The idea of counter-offensives to what Russia is doing. And when you ask the Ukrainian officials about this, they say, look, we don't have the resources, the ability, or the will right now to be pursuing offensive cyber against Russia. That's just not where their priorities are, understandably so. They're worried on protecting not only their physical border, but their cybersecurity borders, so to speak, of their companies and government agencies. But at the same time, something that's happened, as our stereotypical sweatshirted hacker shows us here, is that there have been private hackers from around the world who, just like there are private hackers who are probably not affiliated with Russia who are trying to attack Ukraine, there are a lot of private hackers from around the world that are trying to disrupt Russian operations in Ukraine and in general. What the Ukrainians said about this is that they're grateful to this, that they welcome it. And so it just strikes me as really unprecedented in terms of, maybe not unprecedented as in this is the first time it's ever happened, but as a concept, cyber warfare is unprecedented, because when else in history could you have a time where people who are just way off and far in a different country are actually contributing to the fight? That's a really interesting concept that we'll have to see how rules around that and liability and all these things play out over the years. But right now, it's great that Ukraine is getting this support from people, private hackers around the world. We're nearing the end of the presentation now, and the last thing that I want to talk about is why have there not been big catastrophic cyber attacks like we thought? For a while, it was thought that there weren't that many cyber attacks either, not many more than there had been over the previous few years. The Microsoft report added some texture to that, kind of pushed back against that conclusion. But even when you consider the Microsoft report, the headlines that suggested that things might be really bad have not happened. So, speaking of some of those headlines, here's a Politico article talking about how Russian invasion of Ukraine could redefine cyber warfare. That has not happened. The idea of a massive crippling cyber attack like a cyber 9/11, that has not happened. The conventional wisdom following the invasion, well, the conventional wisdom before the invasion was there's a good chance that these things will happen. The conventional wisdom following the invasion was, well, we haven't seen this happen and this is puzzling. We're not sure why this is the case. And then the Microsoft report says, maybe these things are a little more connected. There's a little more going on than we realized. That's kind of the progression of how things have gone. Why then is it the case that there haven't been more, or at least more effective cyber attacks? There are a few potential, we don't know the reason. Let me preface it by saying that. But there are a few potential reasons that might explain this. The first one is that it's possible that lower rungs on the chain of command weren't aware the invasion would happen. I know I've read some reporting, not related to the cyber stuff in general, that there were Russian officials who were surprised that Putin actually went forward with the invasion. So insofar as these attacks take time to develop, this would suggest that you won't see the really catastrophic things until months down the line, once those people kind of catch up. The Microsoft report lends some doubt to this, I think justifiably so, in terms of talking about how preparations for some of these attacks have been going on since March of 2021. I think because of that, the GRU maybe didn't know for sure that an invasion was coming, but I think they'd certainly been told to gear up for something, at least maybe cyber attacks without an invasion, and so I'm not as convinced by this argument. Russia expected to take Ukraine quickly and didn't want to knock out its infrastructure. This seems pretty legitimate, right? If you thought that you were going to invade a country, if you thought that the Russian invasion of Ukraine was going to look like the American invasion of Iraq in the 90s or really in 2003 in terms of initial success, you might not want to destroy a bunch of infrastructure and communications line that you might have to rely on once you become an occupying power. If this is the case, then what we would expect to see, the prediction that follows from this premise, is that cyber attacks perhaps should gradually increase, because as they realize, okay, this is not going to be as easy, we need to actually defeat Ukraine before we can rule Ukraine, you would expect them to kind of ratchet up those cyber attacks over time. The third explanation is more cyber attacks equals higher chance of spillover, and they want to avoid this. This seems pretty legit. The Germany example we talked about with the wind farm is an example of how spillover effects can be bad, and you could imagine that that other countries would be pretty miffed if a cyber attack made it onto their territory. On the other hand, I have read some articles which suggest that in terms of polling data, the American public at least does not really consider like a cyber attack equivalent to an act of war. So the idea of this of brinksmanship or escalation might not be as big of an issue as some people believe, but maybe Russia believes that it does. This is another thing where you would expect probably that as the invasion goes on, as it becomes clear that they're not getting the job done with what they're currently doing, they might be willing to take more risks. And really, they're not at risks as much because the US has pretty much sanctioned the heck out of Russia. There's not a lot more the US can do in terms of sanctions, in terms of things that don't involve getting directly involved. So maybe they have less to lose if there are spillover effects now compared to February 24th, before all of those sanctions had gone into effect. The last main possible explanation is that offensive cyber is not actually that useful for kinetic operations like an invasion of this sort. And unlike the three previous ones, the prediction that stems from this is that the status quo will probably more or less continue. So the nice thing about this is that if this is correct, which is what I kind of think is correct, We can test it because we just see what happens over the next few months. And yeah, that won't definitively tell us, but that'll give us some indication of which of these explanations is true. So why would I make the claim that offensive cyber is maybe not as useful as people maybe thought that it was going to be, or not as effective as people thought it was going to be? There's a good article from the monkey cage of the Washington Post, which is where academics can go and kind of give condensed versions of their research for a more general audience. That is a really good place to go in general. I particularly like it here because I read an article on there that was talking about this, and it cites some research. For example, this paper that I read for another class, Invisible Digital Front, Can Cyber Attacks Shape Battlefield Events? This is a political science international relations paper which looked at Syria and Ukraine pre this invasion, but looked at Ukraine and found that cyber attacks are actually not that useful on the battlefield. Of course, this could change. It could be that Russia has developed more, but more or less, not just this paper, but a set of scholarship suggests that this is the case. And so I think this is a good example where public policy can definitely look to political science and some of this quantitative social science research for insights on some of these things. Regression analysis that these things tend to include is not perfect, but it seems to me that a lot of the opinions that people have in the public policy sector about this are kind of based on like their experience in the field or based on news articles they've read about this. This kind of systematic, socially scientific approach is not something that I've seen referenced in a lot of the popular articles that I've read about this. And so you have this divide between really, I guess, niche or the academy, researchers at the academy who are looking at this versus people who are looking at it more intuitively, more experience-based. And I just tend to lean, maybe as a political science major, lean a little more on the academia side. A few other points on this. What justification is there for saying that it's overhyped? Well, it hasn't been of that much utility in the past. We know that Russia used cyber attacks in 2014 with the Crimea situation. We don't really have evidence that it helped them very much. We know that there's a swift response when these cyber attacks happened. The power grid was out for an hour in 2016. The ISPs were out for less than 24 hours, right? If you're going to attack something of your enemy, but you're only going to get a few hours out of it for the immense amount of time and energy and money that it costs to create that vulnerability in the first place, it might just not be worth it. And it might be that Russia has decided it's not worth it or realized that it's not worth it. Additionally, countries like Ukraine can take preemptive actions. Individuals can download signal or offline maps. We talked about one of the attacks earlier in the presentation that targeted a mapping system. Well, if I know that unrest is going to be happening, my government tells me, hey, download and offload version of this map so that if the connected version of the app goes down, you have something, that makes that attack much less useful. Finally, a really almost obvious point that I was surprised I didn't think of until I read it was that in many cases, once you actually have an invasion going, it's much easier and cheaper to just hit a bomb, to just use a bomb on something, right? Rather than try to use cyber and find a vulnerability to knock down a power station, you can just drop a bomb on it. Now, obviously, I'm not condoning this, and it's a terrible thing, but when you're in specifically the context of an invasion in an active war zone, that can sometimes be the case. The only thing the only additional cost to that is humanitarian issues, right? If you're dropping a bomb on a place with civilians, not necessarily a good look. But in the case of Russia, what we've seen is that they have been bombing areas with civilians, and once they've crossed that line and shown that they're willing to do that, it's not clear why they would favor a cyber attack on infrastructure as opposed to just attacking the infrastructure with a kinetic attack. It's not clear what the value add there is in terms of the cost. So in general, those are some of the reasons that I'm not fully convinced that, I should say, I'm not surprised that the big predictions about how there were going to be massive cyber attacks against Ukraine and catastrophe was going to happen. Not terribly surprised that that didn't happen because the research out of academia and some of these other countervailing notions suggests that Russia wouldn't actually do that. So, what have we learned? We talked about background. You understand now who some of the key actors are, so that when you're reading the news about these things, you'll know who they're talking about. You understand 6 different categories of Russian cyber attack, and at least one specific example for each one. You understand some of the more conventional responses to this from companies like ESET and Google, and a very innovative approach that Microsoft is taking in this area. And finally, you have had your eyes and ears open up to this debate about cyber offense and whether it was surprising or not the level of massive cyber attacks that we've seen in this conflict. That is the conclusion of this briefing. I hope that you have learned something, and I hope that over the next few months, as this invasion continues to follow, you'll think about some of these issues, think about cyber offense, think about these different forms of attack, and be more educated as you're reading the news and continuing to be a good citizen of the United States.